Thank you for that. Now, you know, this has been an election that's been striking for the lack of specific policies, especially from Donald Trump. But we've assembled a team of experts on foreign policy to discuss all of this. First, we're joined by Christopher Chivvis, whose name I'm sure I just butchered. He's the Associate Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center. Rachel Delevie-Orey, she's the Assistant Director of the Atlantic Council. And the man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to anyway, Marwan Bishara, our Senior Political Analyst for Al Jazeera English. Thank you very much for joining us. First, let's talk Trump. He has a plan in Syria. It's a great plan. He's going to listen to the generals and come up with his own plan, but he already has a plan. Does he have a plan? Chris, first to you.
I can't know for sure. I mean, there is a certain logic to what he says about, you know, you wouldn't want the enemy to know your plan if you had one. If it's really, really good, maybe it's a good idea to keep it secret. But obviously, a lot of people have been asking whether or not he actually has a plan, whether or not he actually even knows anything about Syria to begin with. And I think that in a democratic election like the one that we've just had, those kinds of concerns are not surprising.
Marwan, let me ask you this. Hillary Clinton has made it clear she believes in no-fly zones. Donald Trump has said that's going to lead to World War III with Russia. What does she do on Syria if she wins tonight?
By the way, I think Trump is going to outsource it to the Russians. He already said that. And he's good at outsourcing. That's how he built all his buildings.
And his
by
ties.
Outsourcing them to...
And his ties.
Exactly. I think in terms of Clinton, she's projected quite an ambitious plan. It started with no-fly zones to safety zones, to putting pressures on the Russians, then to working with the Russians. I think she's going to discover as soon as she gets into that White House that Obama has already finished much of the job against ISIL in Iraq and almost in Syria, and that she doesn't have that many choices in Syria. And at the end of the day, she's going to have to work with the Russians, unfortunately, and the Syrian regime, and she's going to have to follow on Mr. Obama's footsteps in trying to find a negotiated settlements in Syria, because there is no, of course, military solution for Syria.
But Rachel, that's a tough pivot. Do you agree with Marwan there? Can you see Hillary Clinton actually working with Russia? I mean, let's think about some of the things she said about Vladimir Putin. She is no fan of his. It's hard for me to imagine that she would do that. What do you think?
Absolutely. It's going to be a difficult balance because on the one hand, I do think that we're going to see Hillary Clinton take a much more hard line when it comes to Russia. I think that she's not going to have the patience for the type of engagement that we've seen with Russia recently. At the same time, I do agree that there's going to be a need to engage with the Assad regime, which unfortunately seems here to stay. He seems to have consolidated power thanks in part to support from the Russians. And so I do think that Hillary Clinton will have to, in order to mitigate the humanitarian costs in Syria, engage with the Assad regime, and that may mean some engagement with Russia.
Just to be clear, I'm not advocating that Assad needs to stay. Of course, there are solutions where the Russians and the Americans can find middle ground, where the Russians can be paid off elsewhere, like in the Ukraine or whatever. But I'm not sure the Syrians are going to accept Assad to stay.
Let me ask you this, because you were talking about additional sanctions on the Russians that Hillary Clinton would pursue because of Syria, not because of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be a question about whether or not, if she's elected president, she tables a new round of sanctions, for example, financial sanctions against Russia in order to deter them from conducting further attacks against civilians in Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria. I think you're going to see a period of a lot of confrontation up front if Hillary Clinton is elected president over Syria and also over Ukraine. Longer term, sure, I think everybody understands, including most of her advisors, and my expectation is Clinton herself, that at some point it's going to be necessary to cooperate with Russia to find a solution to Syria. But we are a long ways from that, and you're going to see confrontation first.
When you said confrontation, spell out for me, what does that mean? Does that mean military confrontation? Or, and getting back to the point of sanctions, tell me where they've ever worked, especially with the Russians. How does that work?
Well, I think they've been very effective when it comes to the sanctions that have been imposed, first of all, over Crimea, and then second of all, when Russia supported Eastern separatists in eastern Ukraine. Those sanctions have really put Russia in a box in a way that it did not expect. And I think we would have seen a much more strong reaction from Russia, potentially sending troops much further into Ukraine if those sanctions had not been put in place. Sure, they haven't solved the problem altogether, but they've contained it up to a degree, and I think it's a policy that could be used again.
We only have a few minutes, so I want to move on to Mexico and the wall, because you have to talk about that in this election. That was what pretty much got Donald Trump where he is, saying he's going to build a wall along the entire southern border, and Mexico is going to pay for it. There has been no discussion of the fact that Congress would never let him build the wall, and Mexico is never going to pay for it because he wants to do it by taking remittances from Mexican people in the U.S., and that's unconstitutional. But The fact that it got him so far, Rachel, let me put this to you. Where does that leave the relationship? Does it do long-term damage between not just Mexico, but Latin America?
Absolutely. This is wildly offensive, not just to Mexicans, but to all Latin Americans who understand that this affects all of them directly or indirectly. As you say, this is not a realistic proposal. It's not something that would ever actually come to fruition, but the rhetoric of it is so confrontational. And it's such a pity, too, after Obama is leaving behind this legacy of really building partnership with Latin America. We see this in his support for new economic opportunity in the Northern Triangle. We see this in his normalization of relations with Cuba. He's really trying to say we're moving past an era in which the United States once was a bit more of an imperial power in the region where it imposed its own beliefs, and we see Latin Americans as economic, political, and social partners. And this wall and the idea that, and the language that was used to describe Mexicans and the idea,
and murderers, yeah.
Very offensive, and the idea that this is a threat and not a partner is something that's deeply damaging to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, a relationship which, you know, just the trade alone, it's a $1.5 billion a day crosses that border. How deeply would that be damaged very practically by a wall? So I do think that that's damaging to the relationship and also, just practically speaking, never going to happen.
Yeah, I have time for one more question. Marwan, I want to ask you this. Every president comes into office and there's the, oh God, didn't see that one coming. If Hillary Clinton is president, what is the moment where she has her, this was a red line moment? What's the big issue?
It's always the Middle East, by the way. I mean, since Truman, the Middle East have always been either the Cold War or the Middle East, or both happening in the Middle East. I think what we will see is that the campaign rhetoric will differ dramatically from realpolitik and real policy once the next president gets into the White House in January 20th. So for the time being, the Mexicans, the Chinese, and the Muslims are the enemies because that's, you know, how you save the American middle class from decline. It's just by blaming it on others. But once the new president gets into the White House, they're going to see if they even touch China, right? They're going to be a world depression, economic depression, recession going to depression. If they're going to even start poking at Muslims, it's going to get 1.5 billion Muslims up in upheaval. And the same thing, of course, with Mexico. So I think much of the rhetoric we've heard over the last few months from both Trump and Clinton, I think like we've heard also from Obama. President Obama, before he was elected president, he said, we're going to have a world free of nuclear weapons, and we're going to have a whole totally changed world. Well, maybe it is changed world, but it's not necessarily to the better. So I think the realities of the world are going to creep up on President Clinton or President Trump, and I think it's not going to be pleasant because it's not going to fit whatever the rhetoric of their campaigns is.
It never does. Thank you all very much for joining us. It's such a pleasure here on Al Jazeera English. We don't just cover the horse race, but we actually talk about the issues because these issues are actually going to matter. It's been remarkable in the States. I have to say there's an anxiety, and it's really turned into a sense of euphoria. People are standing in lines for hours to cast their vote. So it's going to be an interesting election, really unheard of in the history of our lifetime. We're going to have more. We're going to talk about the economy, race relations, all sorts of important topics. But for now, I'm going to toss it back to Doha and Jane.